There's a particular kind of person a narcissist may remain psychologically attached to long after the relationship has ended, and understanding who that person actually is requires moving beyond the usual idea that narcissists simply bond with whoever loves them the most. The truth is considerably more complicated. Attention can attract them, admiration can keep them interested, emotional intensity can create powerful attachment. But none of those things necessarily creates the kind of lasting psychological imprint we're talking about today. The rare person who leaves that kind of imprint isn't necessarily the person who gave the most, sacrificed the most, or tolerated the most. In fact, it's often the opposite. It's the person who managed to see deeply without losing themselves in what they saw. Let's start with the first quality that makes this person so different. They don't confuse understanding someone with excusing them. This distinction matters enormously because empathy can become a vulnerability when it loses its boundaries. Someone who understands why another person behaves destructively may begin creating explanations for behavior that should instead be confronted. They think, "I know why they're doing this," and slowly that understanding becomes permission. The rare person doesn't make that mistake. They can understand the insecurity behind the manipulation without accepting the manipulation. They can recognize the fear underneath the anger without allowing the anger to control them. They can see the wounded part of someone without volunteering to be wounded by them. That combination is unusual because most people eventually move toward one extreme or the other. They either become emotionally absorbed, constantly trying to rescue and understand the person, or they become completely detached and stop seeing the person as human at all. This rare person does something different. They maintain compassion without surrendering discernment. And that creates an experience the narcissist may find unusually difficult to forget. Here's why. Someone who is emotionally dependent can often be influenced through the fear of losing the relationship. If they need approval, reassurance, or constant emotional connection, those needs can become pressure points. But someone who genuinely cares while remaining internally secure doesn't respond to those pressure points in the same way. They don't need to punish. They don't need to manipulate back. They don't need to win. They simply remain grounded. And that groundedness can be profoundly disorienting to someone accustomed to relationships being organized around emotional control. This is where the second quality appears. The rare person has a life that exists independently of the relationship. They have their own interests, their own identity, their own friendships, their own goals, their own internal world. They may love deeply, but the relationship isn't their entire source of meaning. That distinction becomes incredibly important, because when someone's entire identity becomes connected to the relationship, losing the relationship can feel like losing themselves. That creates fear, and fear can make someone increasingly willing to tolerate behavior they would otherwise reject. The rare person doesn't operate that way. They may be devastated by betrayal. They may grieve deeply. They may struggle emotionally. But somewhere underneath all of it remains a core understanding. I am still me without you. That sentence changes the entire dynamic, because affection given freely feels different from affection given out of fear. When someone stays because they genuinely choose you, their presence has a different psychological weight than someone who stays because they're terrified of leaving. The narcissist may not consciously understand this distinction, but they can experience it. They can feel when someone isn't completely dependent on their approval. They can sense when someone's love isn't the same thing as submission. And that is exactly where the rare person's influence becomes unusual. They don't try to become indispensable. They simply become unforgettable through authenticity. Here's another quality. This person notices inconsistencies, not obsessively, not suspiciously, not by constantly searching for evidence. They simply pay attention. If someone's words and behavior don't match, they notice. If an apology is followed by the same behavior, they notice. If affection appears primarily when they're pulling away, they notice. If the emotional atmosphere changes whenever they establish a boundary, they notice. And perhaps most importantly, they don't allow someone to continuously talk them out of what they've observed. This doesn't mean they're incapable of making mistakes. They can misinterpret situations. They can apologize. They can change their mind. They can acknowledge when they're wrong. But they don't surrender their perception simply because another person becomes angry about it. That makes them difficult to control through confusion. And this is where many relationships with narcissistic dynamics begin breaking apart. The narcissist may initially believe that the person's emotional investment means they're safe to push. They may test boundaries. They may introduce small violations. They may watch how the person responds. And when the response isn't what they expected, they may escalate. But eventually something becomes clear. This person isn't going to abandon themselves just to preserve the relationship. That is the moment the entire dynamic changes. Because the narcissist may be accustomed to relationships where enough pressure eventually produces compliance. The rare person doesn't necessarily become louder when pressured. They become clearer. And clarity is much harder to manipulate than emotional intensity. They may say less. They may explain less. They may stop defending themselves. They may simply decide what they will and won't participate in. And this is where another misconception needs to be addressed. The rare person isn't necessarily cold. In fact, they may be extremely warm. They may love intensely. They may be extraordinarily loyal. They may give people more chances than they deserve. But their loyalty has a limit, and that limit is self-abandonment. Once they realize that remaining connected requires them to continuously betray their own values, something inside them begins changing. The relationship stops being an expression of love and starts becoming a conflict with identity. And for this person, identity eventually wins. That is why the title says one rare person, not because there is literally only one human being in the world capable of affecting a narcissist, but because this combination of qualities is genuinely uncommon. Deep empathy, strong discernment, emotional independence, self-respect, warmth without dependency, compassion without self-sacrifice, and the ability to walk away without needing revenge. That's the combination that creates a very different kind of relational experience. And here's something even more important. This person doesn't spend their life trying to prove that they're different. They don't announce that they're a super empath. They don't threaten to leave every time they're upset. They don't constantly remind the narcissist what they bring to the relationship. They simply live from a stable sense of self. That stability becomes visible through behavior. When conflict happens, they don't immediately collapse. When they are criticized, they don't automatically assume they're worthless. When someone withdraws affection, they don't desperately chase it. When someone attempts to provoke jealousy, they don't need to compete. When someone accuses them unfairly, they don't spend hours trying to prove their innocence to someone committed to misunderstanding them. They understand something that takes many people years to learn. You cannot force someone to see you accurately, and you don't have to spend your life trying. This is especially powerful because narcissistic dynamics often depend on emotional reaction. The more you react, the more material exists for another interaction. Your anger becomes something to attack. Your defensiveness becomes something to criticize. Your explanations become opportunities to find contradictions. Your fear becomes leverage. Your need for closure becomes an invitation to keep the conversation going. But when someone becomes emotionally grounded, much of that material disappears. They don't become emotionless. They simply stop making every emotion available for manipulation. And that distinction is crucial because emotional strength isn't the absence of feeling. It's the ability to feel without surrendering your decisions to the feeling. The rare person can be hurt and still leave. They can miss someone and still maintain distance. They can love someone and still say no. They can forgive someone and still never return. They can understand someone and still refuse to participate in their destructive behavior. That is a level of emotional independence that creates a completely different kind of bond. And sometimes, ironically, the narcissist recognizes the value of that person most clearly only after access to them disappears. While the relationship is active, entitlement can make someone's presence feel guaranteed. After the relationship ends, reality becomes harder to ignore. The person who once provided warmth, attention, understanding, and emotional depth is no longer available in the same way. And replacement isn't always as simple as finding another person who gives attention. Attention is easy to find. A specific combination of depth, perception, emotional maturity, and self-respect is much harder to replace. This is where the lasting imprint begins. Not because the rare person intentionally tries to haunt them, not because they use some psychological trick, not because they make themselves unavailable as a strategy, but because authentic connection leaves information behind. The narcissist experienced what it felt like to be deeply seen by someone who still refused to surrender their identity. And once that experience exists, it cannot simply be erased. But there's an important warning here. If you're listening to this and thinking, I want to become that person so the narcissist will never forget me, you're missing the entire point. The goal isn't to become unforgettable to them. The goal is to become unforgettable to yourself. To remember who you were before you started measuring your worth through another person's behavior. To remember what you believed love was supposed to feel like. To remember what you wanted from your life before the relationship consumed so much emotional space. Because the rare person isn't powerful because a narcissist remembers them. They're powerful because they eventually remember themselves. And that is where this story becomes much bigger than the narcissist, because the person who can love deeply without losing themselves doesn't only become difficult to forget, they become difficult to destroy. And in part 2, we're going deeper into what happens when this rare person finally stops trying to be understood, stops trying to prove their worth, and realizes that their greatest power was never the ability to make someone stay. It was the ability to walk away while still knowing exactly who they are. And this is where the rare person's presence becomes even more significant, because the thing that separates them from everyone else isn't simply that they can walk away. Plenty of people eventually walk away. The difference is what happens internally before, during, and after that decision. They don't walk away as a performance. They don't leave hoping the narcissist will chase them. They don't disappear so someone will finally realize their value. They don't create distance to trigger jealousy. They don't make themselves unavailable as a psychological tactic. They leave because something inside them has become clearer than their attachment. And that distinction changes everything. Because when someone leaves strategically, they're still emotionally connected to the outcome. They're watching the phone. They're checking social media. They're wondering whether the other person noticed. They're waiting for the message that proves the strategy worked. But when someone leaves from genuine clarity, there is eventually a point where the reaction no longer matters. That's the transformation. The rare person doesn't need the narcissist to chase them in order to know they were valuable. They don't need an apology to know they were hurt. They don't need regret to know they mattered. They don't need jealousy to prove they were difficult to replace. And they don't need another person to confirm the decision they made for themselves. This is what emotional independence actually looks like. And it's much harder to imitate than people realize. You can imitate silence, you can imitate indifference, you can imitate confidence, you can stop responding to messages, but genuine detachment is different because it exists when nobody is watching. It's the moment you stop rehearsing imaginary conversations. It's the moment you stop wondering what they're thinking. It's the moment you stop checking whether they noticed your absence. It's the moment you stop needing their next move to tell you whether you made the right decision. That's when the relationship loses its psychological grip. And this is exactly why the rare person can become such a powerful memory. Not because they were perfect. They weren't. They had flaws. They made mistakes. They may have stayed too long. They may have given too many chances. They may have ignored signs that, in hindsight, seem obvious. But eventually, they learned something the narcissist couldn't control. They learned how to trust themselves again. And once self-trust returns, manipulation becomes much harder. Because manipulation often depends on making you doubt your own perception. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you're remembering it wrong. Maybe you're being selfish. Maybe you're expecting too much. Maybe you're the problem. If you believe those messages long enough, you begin outsourcing your judgment. You start asking the other person what happened instead of trusting what you experienced. The rare person eventually stops doing that. They don't assume they're always right. But they also don't assume they're always wrong. They become willing to examine themselves without automatically abandoning themselves. That balance is incredibly powerful because genuine self-awareness isn't the same thing as self-blame. A healthy person can say, I handled that badly, without saying, therefore everything they did to me was justified. They can accept responsibility for their mistakes without accepting responsibility for someone else's choices, and that distinction protects them from one of the most damaging cycles in toxic relationships, taking responsibility for everything. If the narcissist is angry, you caused it. If they're distant, you caused it. If they betrayed you, you weren't enough. If they lied, you didn't make them feel safe enough. If they became cruel, you somehow triggered them. Eventually, the person begins believing that if they can just become better, calmer, more attractive, more patient, more understanding, more successful, more forgiving, or more emotionally intelligent, they can finally prevent the other person's destructive behavior. But another person's choices are not a referendum on your worth. And once the rare person truly understands that, something fundamental changes. They stop trying to earn basic respect. Respect becomes a requirement, not a reward. They stop trying to earn honesty. Honesty becomes a foundation. They stop trying to earn consistency. Consistency becomes something they observe before investing further. This is why they become much more selective. Not because they believe they're superior, because they've learned the cost of ignoring incompatibility. And this creates another quality that can make them difficult to replace. They no longer confuse chemistry with compatibility. Chemistry can be immediate. Compatibility reveals itself over time. Chemistry can make you overlook problems. Compatibility requires that you actually function well together. Chemistry can make someone feel irresistible. Compatibility determines whether the relationship can survive ordinary life. The rare person learns to ask deeper questions. How does this person handle frustration? How do they respond when they're wrong? Can they apologize without adding a justification? Can they hear criticism without turning it into revenge? Can they respect privacy? Can they respect independence? Can they celebrate someone else's success without feeling diminished? Can they tolerate boundaries? Can they disagree without humiliating? These questions reveal much more than charm. And this is especially important because narcissistic relationships can begin with extraordinary intensity. The connection may feel unique. The attention may feel overwhelming. The chemistry may seem almost impossible to explain. You may feel completely understood. You may feel chosen. You may feel like you finally met someone who sees something in you nobody else has seen. But intensity isn't proof of compatibility, and attention isn't proof of intimacy. Sometimes the most important thing you can observe is how someone behaves after the initial intensity fades, because everyone can be impressive during pursuit. What happens afterward? That is where the real relationship begins, and the rare person learns to slow down enough to observe. They don't need to rush intimacy. They don't need to prove their loyalty immediately. They don't give unlimited access simply because someone is intensely interested. They allow trust to develop through evidence. That alone changes the entire pattern, because access becomes something earned through consistency rather than something granted through chemistry. And when someone finally realizes this, they become much harder to pull into a cycle of idealization and devaluation. They don't become emotionally unavailable. They become emotionally discerning. There is a difference. Emotional unavailability says, I don't need anyone. Emotional discernment says, I can need connection without abandoning my standards. That is a much healthier form of strength. And this brings us to something else that makes the rare person psychologically memorable. And this is where the deepest truth about the so-called rare person finally becomes clear. The person a narcissist may remember for years isn't necessarily the most beautiful person, the most successful person, the most submissive person, or even the person who loved them the hardest. It may be the person who gave them something they couldn't easily reproduce somewhere else. Genuine connection without surrender. That combination is rare. Someone can love you deeply and still have no boundaries. Someone can have strong boundaries and become emotionally unavailable. Someone can understand you and still tolerate everything you do. Someone can reject you completely and never allow themselves to feel vulnerable. But the rare person can hold two truths at the same time. I care about you, and I will not allow you to destroy me. I understand you, and I am still holding you responsible for your choices. I can forgive you, and if forgiveness doesn't require access to me, I miss you, and I am still not coming back. That's emotional maturity, and it's precisely why this kind of person can leave such a deep impression. Because they don't fit neatly into the categories that manipulation often relies on. They aren't completely dependent, they aren't completely detached, they aren't easily intimidated, they aren't endlessly available, and they aren't interested in controlling the other person either. They simply know who they are. This is something people often misunderstand about confidence. Real confidence isn't walking into a room believing you're better than everyone else. Real confidence is being able to remain yourself when someone else doesn't approve of you. That's very different. A person with genuine self-trust doesn't need universal approval. They can tolerate being misunderstood. They can tolerate someone being disappointed. They can tolerate being disliked. They can tolerate someone leaving. And that ability creates an enormous amount of freedom. because many manipulative dynamics depend on making rejection feel unbearable. If you believe that someone else's rejection means you're worthless, you'll do almost anything to prevent it. You'll over-explain. You'll apologize for things you didn't do. You'll chase. You'll compromise. You'll abandon your standards. You'll accept behavior you once promised yourself you would never accept. But once you realize that being rejected doesn't determine your value, the leverage disappears. You can finally say, if you don't want to treat me well, I can survive that. And that sentence is incredibly powerful, not because it's threatening, because it's true. The rare person doesn't threaten abandonment. They understand that access to them is voluntary, and this is why their departure can feel so different from previous departures.